The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, a senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, as we record this, we are really just a few days away from the opening ceremonies of the 7th Ministerial Meeting of the Summit on the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. This is a very big deal. We've been talking about it all month, exploring all different facets of the China-Africa relationship that will no doubt be erased next week in Beijing when 50 African leaders will be meeting together and also with their Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping to talk about really the future of China-Africa relations. And so all month we've been kind of focusing on the environment, on media, on military affairs, but really what's going to come out of the forum is going to be a big number. The big number is going to be 50 billion, 60 billion, 70 billion, and it's a financial package, a very, very complex financial package that a lot of it will be used to finance infrastructure and this physical type of development. It's really been the hallmark of Chinese aid. Now, what's interesting now is in the run-up to this meeting, there's been a lot of speculation as to what will come of it. And the United States and certain Western academics have been raising a lot of concerns about how much money the Chinese are actually loaning to Africa. And we've talked with Judy Moore, who's the former Liberian infrastructure minister and public works minister there, about the calculations and African agency in this decision and in this relationship to loan and to take on these loans. And so, Cobus, I guess my question for you is, now that the meeting is finally here and that we're going to be seeing a big number come out of it, we don't know exactly how much. What is your feeling in terms of this debate that's raging about the effectiveness of these loans versus the impact that they'll have on African development?
I think, the issue of the loans don't stand alone. The issue of the loans are connected to Africa's whole economic future. There's a lot of debates in Africa at the moment about how Africa should move forward, especially because the population of Africa is so young. So in theory, Africa has the opportunity to have a similar kind of growth spurt as China had and as Southeast Asia is having at the moment, where the majority of the population is young and they have a lot of energy and they can work and they can power kind of very rapid development. However, in order to do that, Africa needs infrastructure and they need infrastructure in order to industrialize. So without the infrastructure, you have a very difficult situation where you have a lot of young people with nothing to do, and so the issue isn't simply whether Africa takes big loans or not. The issue is more how Africa is going to move forward. And if Africa doesn't move forward, it will be a real weight on the entire global economy. And if Africa does move forward, it could actually drive the global economy in the future. So I think it's a big issue that affects all of us.
So the stakes are very, very high, which is why we thought that this would be the appropriate final show to do before the FOCAC summit, because it will be no doubt the centerpiece of the discussions going on in Beijing. And so to do that, we wanted to bring another insider. We had a lot of success with our program with Judy Moore because he was somebody who actually spoke from experience. This is a guy who sat across the table from his Chinese counterparts, negotiated the contracts, negotiated the loans, and implemented those construction projects. And we thought that was the way to approach this subject. So we are just absolutely thrilled and humbled that we're able to have Mr. Andrew Alli, who is the former CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation. Now, if for those of you not familiar with AFC, it's a public-private development finance institution based in Lagos. It's been around for about 11 years. He oversaw a portfolio of about $4.5 billion of investments in 30 countries across the continent. Today, he's now a contributor for the online business news site Quartz, and he joins us for the very first time on the program from London. Mr. Alli, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to be on your program.
It's great. Well, again, as I mentioned, you are somebody who actually sat across from the Chinese, and you recently wrote an article. I think it was your first article for Quartz, How to Separate the Myths and Realities of China's Role in Tackling Africa's Infrastructure Deficit. What was so interesting about your article is that you spoke from experience. And I think a good way for us to start our discussion today, before we get into the nitty gritty of debt and infrastructure and loans and whether it makes sense, is why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience over the years in working both with AFC and in other business roles that you've had in dealing with the Chinese, and talk a little bit about your point of view and where you're coming from on this topic.
Well, so my own career has spanned at least the last 20 years doing investments in Africa, mainly in infrastructure. So before I joined the AFC, I used to work for the International Finance Corporation, also investing in infrastructure. So it's interesting that I've seen, first of all, the rise of the Chinese presence in the continent of Africa over the last couple of decades. We've tried as much as possible, particularly when I was at AFC, to involve as many different sources of finance. I mean, we were really, to be frank, pretty agnostic as to where the investment was coming from and where the expertise was coming from, as long as it, was fit for purpose. And so we tried to sort of drum up as much business as we could with Chinese, with the traditional funders, and also even looking at investments from the Middle East and other parts of Asia. So I've had a sort of ringside seat to see how Chinese investment and Chinese activity in infrastructure in Africa has evolved over time. Certainly, a lot of it is done at a government-to-government level. And what you'll see at this summit, and a lot of the numbers that are announced are really going to be, loans to government to do big government-type infrastructure projects. Now, as those of us who've been working on infrastructure in Africa know, in fact, a lot of where it's really happening and where the action is on the private sector side. And there we've seen increasing Chinese involvement, but that has been much slower than them dealing directly with governments, which is, I think, what they're used to and the model that they've followed even in other parts of the world. My own personal take on China, which I said in the article, is that for me, I think it's positive, not necessarily because Chinese investment is necessarily all good all the time. It isn't. It has its issues. I think those issues are often exaggerated. But because it brings an element of competition into the whole mix, it gives Africans and African governments more options, more choice. And generally speaking, the more options you have, the better value you can get out of it. Of course, in your introduction, you spoke about African governments and Africans needing to have agency. And in terms of dealing with infrastructure investors, it's important, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Americans or the Europeans, to, act from a position of having a certain degree of agency, making your own choices and doing what's best for your own country. Because no matter which type of investor you're talking about, you are the one who has to take charge. And I think that that's somewhat the missing element in many of these in many of these discussions. People talk as if African governments or African countries are just sort of passive receivers of these investments, which sadly sometimes they are. But if you really want to develop your own economy, you've got to be an active participant. You've got to sort of have a plan and look for people who are going to help you implement that plan, rather than just sort of accepting what anybody chooses to, quote unquote, give to you.
So, on the point of African agency, one of the examples that's raised frequently in the discussions around Chinese financing to Africa is the standard gauge railway in Kenya, which is a lot of people have alleged that the Kenyan government essentially overpaid or paid much higher than world rates for that railway, and that there would have been much cheaper ways of getting the same work done. I know you might not be able to speak to that particular example, but what are some of the factors in your experience that lead to African governments overpaying for these kind of projects?
So I would say 2 or 3 things tend to happen. One is very often governments have been struggling to get something off the ground. And therefore, when people offer something to them, they don't necessarily, how do I put it? They're just so grateful that somebody is offering them some money or some sort of piece of infrastructure that they often sometimes fail to do their homework. Of course, as you said, I don't know the circumstances of the SGR in Kenya, so these are generic statements, but often they fail to do their homework and do sort of proper benchmarking. The second point, which is really related to the first point, is that what we have found anyway is that it's much better to have a competitive process. So when I was at the AFC, we were one of the principals behind a big power project in Ghana. And in that particular case, we had open tenders for the contracting. And we had a Chinese consortium, and we also had a South African consortium. And the first thing was that by opening it up for competition, we reduced those prices by about 30%. And of course, we had good benchmarks because other people had made bids. And then as we went through the process and really dug into what was involved, we found in this case that when you took all the costs into account, the South African consortium actually worked out slightly cheaper. And the last point, I think, is possibly another thing that tends to happen in these projects is that the government's focus on what we call the EPC cost, so the engineering, procurement, and contracting cost, which is, the cost of actually physically building whatever piece of infrastructure it is. But there are actually a lot of other costs that go into the overall project, like the interest that you pay during the construction period, the working capital cost to get it started up, all those kind of costs. And very often governments don't factor those costs in. So again, if I go back to the Ghanaian example I gave, the actual EPC cost quoted by the Chinese consortium was actually cheaper than that quoted by the South African consortium in this particular case. So, one may have jumped on the Chinese offer. But actually, when you did the digging and you put in all the different financing costs, including some insurance that the Chinese consortium's financiers were insisting upon, then actually the Chinese offer worked out, as I said, slightly more expensively. Thus, I think that, a lack of proper analysis is another factor. The final factor, and these are all somewhat interrelated, is inadequate preparation and also inadequate project management. The first part of that, inadequate preparation, so very often with these big civil engineering projects, if you don't do what they call the sort of geoengineering properly, then you can find during construction that maybe you need more foundations than had originally been thought about, or you may even have to deviate around somewhere. And if you find these things out halfway through, it can be incredibly expensive because you're now making a deviation from the original contract. The second point is lack of project management. So you have to make sure that you project manage these the implementations of these contracts very tightly. You have to make sure there are as few changes as possible, because every change, as I said, costs an awful lot. And you also have to make sure that it continues to track on time, because if you add time to these things, the costs can escalate very quickly. So unfortunately, when you're doing billion-dollar plus projects, they get very, very complicated. And what we often find is that, simply because they haven't done that many projects before, African governments are very often inadequate in terms of being able to handle the technical aspects of these projects. And then this leads to things going out of control and cost escalations.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
Well, let's pick up the conversation there, because that leads us into the negatives about this. So you've talked about how running these projects is very, very complex, and particularly these billion-dollar infrastructure projects, which many African states have not had. And so you run into maybe a skills shortage in terms of project managing from the point of view on the African side. And then you talk about in your article how so much of the issues of quality and labor, these are some of the most sensitive issues in the China-Africa infrastructure discussion, are on the burden of the African side, not the Chinese side. So a lot of people will see a road that's falling apart and they'll blame the Chinese contractor, when in fact, as you're pointing out, that a lot of this might have come from the engineering and the project management that should have been done originally by the African partner side. Or on the labor side, which is arguably the most sensitive political issue, where people have, remember Michael Sata many years ago, the former president of Zambia, said, I'm never going to have a Chinese pushing a wheelbarrow in my country.
Yes.
But these are points for you to negotiate, and yet that's not happening. So it brings me up to the point that came up this week. I don't know if you saw it in the Financial Times. Luke Patey, who is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, wrote a very provocative column saying the Chinese model is failing in Africa. And in many ways, he echoed what the White House and the United States has been saying for at least a year now, that China is basically encircling Africa with debt. And because maybe either intentionally or unintentionally, and I mean by unintentionally is that maybe the skills aren't there in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in places like Chad to handle these kinds of deals. So what ends up happening is they take on massive amounts of loans, and they're not doing what you want them to do, which is to competitively bid them out, make sure that these contracts are negotiated well, make sure that all the projects are managed well and properly project scoped and whatnot. And so that's not happening. So I'm curious to get your feedback as the volume of criticism about Chinese debt rises in Africa for these infrastructure loans. And at the same time, you're pointing out the fact that maybe some of the burden for that responsibility is on the African side. So talk to us a little bit about that debate that's going on right now and how you see it.
Well, I saw that op-ed. I think it was in yesterday's Financial Times, or maybe over the weekend. And it raised some interesting points. I think, obviously there's some truth in what he said, but I also think the spin is a little bit different, because just before I go into the specifics, I'd like to point out that back in the early 2000s, there was a big debt crisis in Africa, and there was a major debt relief effort called the highly indebted poor countries effort, which relieved the debt of a lot of African countries and some other countries around the world. Now, the point here is that debt crisis, because the Chinese weren't investing and weren't really lending in the 70s and 80s, that debt crisis was actually not caused by the Chinese quote-unquote model. And the fact is that I think it's up to really each government at the end of the day to, be able to assess and decide what debt to take on, how much debt to take on, etc. And, you have agencies like the World Bank and the IMF, much as those can be somewhat unpopular in certain African countries, who are geared up to advise on, debt sustainability, debt capacity, etc. Now, I think that going more specific than this, again, very often, unfortunately, there are quite a few countries in Africa where the capacity for various reasons is relatively low. One, to assess the overall macro condition of the country, and secondly, to be able to assess and negotiate these projects. And when you combine that can lead to the wrong decisions being made. Often, infrastructure projects are being done often for ego or for prestige purposes, and not necessarily because they will generate a large financial or economic return. So, for example, having a very nice soccer stadium in your capital city probably isn't going to generate the same sort of economic bounce as having an up-to-date airport might. So, I think that the one thing is that the Chinese, and obviously one is, hugely generalizing talking about the Chinese, but the Chinese tend not to second guess what African countries are doing, in the same way that certain Western, particularly aid-related financiers may second guess. But, I think that is a very large generalization. And, there are a lot of white elephant projects that have also been financed, from Western sources using Western contractors. So again, really, I think for me, the onus is really on the countries to have responsibility for what they're doing, to make sure that they are sort of doing projects that are going to have an economic benefit, and that those projects are implemented properly so as to maximize the chances of those economic benefits occurring. And finally, to ensure that, on a macro level, even if a particular project is good, that on a macro level, you're not overextending yourself in terms of doing that project. Now, as I said before, I'm not naive enough to suggest that all African countries have the technical capability to do this, but I think that capability rests in a number of African countries. Certainly, the country in which I'm based in Nigeria, has vast amounts of technical capability. Other smaller countries do as well. So this is not something that is lacking in Africa, but I think it's also, it does lack in certain areas, and even countries that are generally well equipped may not have expertise in, say, large nuclear power stations or large even hydro projects, for example, if they haven't done any, or if they haven't done any in several decades. And, that's the point at which people need to, or countries need to also realize that, okay, this is getting a little bit beyond us, and, let's get some help. And, again, there are agencies like the African Development Bank, like the World Bank, other private consultancies that they can hire to help them in terms of managing these projects. And when I say managing, I don't mean just the project management, but the overall management of the project from the beginning to the end, to ensure that it does have a successful outcome. So a lot, I guess where I'm coming from is that a lot of the burden of responsibility ultimately lies with the governments of the countries concerned, and they need to perhaps do more than they have been doing to make sure that those outcomes are positive and not negative.
One of the themes that we hear a lot in China-Africa issues is the call for Africa to negotiate more collectively with China, either as a continent or as in the form of regional economic communities like ECOWAS or the Southern African Development Community. You know, in your experience as someone who's worked with on the ground with these projects, is that a realistic idea? Is it possible for Africa to work with China and other financiers in that way, or are they doomed to work in a kind of a bilateral relationship always?
So I don't think that's a very realistic prospect, in the sense that most projects, not all projects, but most projects actually are within an individual country. And thus it's very hard to understand how a sort of collective negotiation might work. The second point is that actually when you are doing something collectively involving a number of different governments, the complexity of that goes up exponentially. And even if you're trying to do it through an organization like, let's say, the African Union, most of the governments, and let's say it's a regional project, so it actually does involve more than one country. Most of the governments that would be involved in that, if not all of them, would still want to keep their own individual sovereignty. And therefore, you know, they wouldn't fully delegate any kind of negotiation. I mean, in reality, I mean, they may say it, but in reality, they're not going to fully delegate negotiation of something that would involve their sovereignty, involve them maybe taking on debt or liabilities for the next 30 years. To, you know, some third-party organization, whether it's the AU, whether it's the World Bank or whomever, to do it, you know, collectively on their behalf. So they'd all want a seat, you know, either at the negotiating table or at a table in, metaphorically speaking, a side room, you know, behind the negotiating table where they can sort of tell the negotiator what they want. So in practical reality, I don't think that's really a solution to the problem. I think for me, the solution to the problem is really, firstly, for governments to take a realistic look at their own capabilities and where they see gaps to you know, be humble enough to call in for help. And, you know, that help can be either a sort of public organization like the African Development Bank or private consultancies or a combination of both. And certainly in the long run, spending, you know, $1 million, say, paying consultancy fees to private consultants to sort of get a sort of $2 billion port or power plant or airport implemented well, you know, is actually money very well spent.
Very quickly, because I know you're very tight on time and we're almost out of time ourselves. When most people are listening to this program, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit will be underway. African leaders will be negotiating. They're going, a lot of them, with very big wish lists. I know President Uhuru Kenyatta, also Ghana's president, are going with big infrastructure asks to Beijing. Like to kind of have you look forward a little bit. They're going to come out of this meeting with a lot of money and a lot more loans coming their way. Are you generally optimistic about the future and the debt for infrastructure deals that are being done? Or are you becoming increasingly nervous, like a lot of people are, that the money is just getting up too high?
Well, I would answer that in two ways, both in very general terms. So the first one is that, as I said right at the beginning, if you look at the last 2 decades, China has come from virtually zero to being the 4th largest investor in infrastructure assets in Africa, after the US, UK, and France, who are the sort of, the last two are the traditional colonial powers in Africa, and then the US, obviously, the world's largest economy. So China is a significant player, And as I said in the article, I think that the added competition that China brings is a positive thing because it provides more choice to African countries and puts pressure on other people to improve their terms. So to that extent, I think that the Chinese involvement in Africa is a positive thing. The second point I want to make is that, as I mentioned, back in the early 2000s, there was a lot of debt forgiveness. And that meant that the fiscal position or the monetary positions of many African countries improved very significantly because the debt to GDP ratios were cut very substantially and to a sustainable point. Sadly, since then, rather than sort of using that reset as a way of being more prudent, since then, debt to GDP ratios across Africa have generally been increasing. And certainly earlier this year, I believe the IMF produced a report talking about them being concerned about a number of African countries getting into a position where their debt is becoming less and less sustainable. Now, the reason why I'm making these very general points is that those countries accumulating debt for projects which are sort of quote-unquote Chinese is certainly part of the problem. But I'm sure that not all of that debt is going to Chinese investors. And that issue is really more one about general macroeconomic management or poor macroeconomic management on the part of certain, but not all countries, rather than a particular problem to do with Chinese infrastructure investment leading to debt. The final point I would make is that, again, overall, infrastructure is a very necessary part of development. You can't develop your countries without having infrastructure, but it's got to be the right infrastructure. And, if the Chinese are willing to put that right infrastructure in, I'm happy to take it. If it's the Americans, the British, the French, I'm also happy to take it. What I want to see is development in Africa. And I think that whoever is going to help us to develop should be welcomed positively.
The article is How to Separate the Myths and Realities of China's Role in Tackling Africa's Infrastructure Deficit. It is required reading this week. Don't walk, run to get this article from Quartz Africa. You can find it at qz.com. Just look for Andrew Alli, A-L-L-I is how you'll find his last name. And Andrew is the former CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation, a public-private development finance institution based in Lagos, where he spent years overseeing billions of dollars in infrastructure investment across 30 countries in Africa. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time. Your insights were invaluable, particularly at this time of the summit. And we'd like to come back to you in a few weeks and months to see kind of what came out of it and where we go with all the infrastructure discussion that is no doubt going to continue.
Thank you for having me on, and I'd be very glad to have a follow-up on this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cobus, I have to say that I'm more confused now than before we started this program. I just don't know where to kind of come down on this, because on the one hand, I understand where the critics are coming from in saying that the debt is rising at an unsustainable level, and to the point where you simply will not be able to generate the necessary economic activity to pay back the billions of dollars that countries like Kenya, Uganda, Ghana are taking on, and Djibouti as well. On the other hand, when you speak to people like Judy Moore, and you speak to people like Andrew, who we just talked to, you hear this nuance, you hear this calculation, you hear all of this subtlety that's missing from the rest of the debate. And again, I don't know if Luke Patey's article in the Financial Times helped things or not. We're going to speak with Luke actually in a coming show to get his take on it. But it really sparked an enormous amount of conversation online because it fits one of the negative narratives that's being actively promoted by the United States, I don't think constructively, to say that this is danger. And of course, they usually bring up the fact that the port in Sri Lanka was repoed by the Chinese as example of what can happen. I take Judy Moore's kind of point on that of all the things that the Chinese have invested, the hundreds of deals that they've done around the world, we're only talking about one repo, one repossession. So that to me doesn't kind of mark a trend. And the interesting thing, I thought Andrew was going to go there, was the fact that I think the story is too young right now for us to come to any firm conclusions about what the Chinese are going to do with all this debt. We don't know if all of these countries are going to be forced to have to pay back this debt. We've seen some debt relief in Zimbabwe. We've seen them be flexible in Venezuela. And this is kind of a point that Matt Furchin, who's the China Latin America scholar, makes as well, saying that there's a lot of nuance in how the Chinese approach the debt issue. So for anybody to come down on one side or the other, it may be premature. And that's where my confusion lies, because I just don't know how to feel about this.
I agree. I mean, it's very difficult. For me, it comes back to, also the reality that Africa has to find some kind of way to develop. What I find disingenuous frequently in the Western way of looking at this as, Chinese debt as this kind of strategic tool to trap countries is they tend to pretend that those countries have very easy other options for financing. That they shouldn't go to the Chinese, they should just go to the World Bank, or that they should just go to Western lenders. And that leaves out two crucial details. In the first place, a lot of African debt is Western debt, despite despite all of the debt forgiveness, highly indebted poor country program that wiped out some of that debt. A lot of African debt at the moment is not only Western debt, but it's Western private debt, which tends to run at high interest rates. So that's an issue to take into account. The other one is that frequently especially for big projects like airports, frequently, governments would just wait years and years to kind of put together a deal with Western lenders on these big projects. And then, from the kind of the perspective, the debt book kind of critic perspective that we're seeing coming out a lot of out of the US, that seems to be just okay. It's okay for country X in Africa to struggle on for years and years without an airport, without taking into account the kind of domino effect that has on the effect on the prosperity of the entire country, the entire sub-region, and then the roll-on effect that has on migration to Europe and religious radicalization and other kinds of terrorism and all of these different issues. For me, they frequently. There seems to be a lack of urgency, in this discussion, frequently coming from Western critics, which tend to then, underplay some of the pressures faced by African governments when they take on Chinese debt. I think it's very important to be realistic about the kind of pressures that Africa faces when you're talking about these choices.
And it's much more complicated than is reflected on social media, where I think too many people have this attitude of it's easy to solve. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And that's why for a lot of people following the discussion online, it's hard to know what to feel. And I think that's why, although Andrew was very, very kind of thorough and detailed, it gets complicated. And that's why his input, I think, is so important for us to really listen to. Also, I think go back and read his article carefully. He seems to be well balanced in it, recognizing the risks, but at the same time acknowledging what Cobus is talking about, how there are tremendous opportunities tapping into Chinese capital, but it has to be managed well. And a lot of the burden, and this is something also missing from the debate that I think Andrew brought up, a lot of the burden falls on the African side. Africans are not victims here, and this is one of the key themes of our program here, is that the labor issue is a point of negotiation. The skills transfer is a point of negotiation, and those negotiations, after they are agreed in the contracts, have to be enforced. So we come back to the core issue of governance. And, go ahead.
No, kind of just linking to that, we come to the core issue of governance, but also, even if you have sterling A1 platinum grade governance, development is still a messy process. So frequently the systems that Western countries criticize other developing countries for not following, those systems frequently came after long processes of quite messy development, and a lot of the kind of big infrastructure development that now eases Western economic life and Western economic growth, a lot of those systems, the subway system in New York, for example, those big, massive systems were put in a long time ago. The one of the values of China's relationship with Africa is the fact that China put in those systems quite recently. And if you look at the Chinese experience of development, it was not easy. I mean, they did a lot of stuff right, but they did a lot of stuff wrong. And, they made a lot of mistakes in the process. And I don't think you really get to develop without making those kind of mistakes. So I sometimes find it a little unfair that, that people would cherry pick 3 or 4 kind of examples of projects that came in over budget in Africa and then go, oh, see, this is completely corrupt. It's completely impossible. They should just consider a different model. It's like, this is a long process, and some mistakes are going to get made. And of course, one needs to do as much as you can to avoid corruption and to make sure that the deals are the best deals that you can get and to do due diligence, as Andrew said. But at the same time, it's not a foolproof process.
What do you think? This is an emotive issue. It's very, very powerful. People have very strong opinions on all sides. We'd like to hear from you. We have these discussions going on online all the time. You can find me on LinkedIn, where we have a very robust conversation, also on Facebook, Twitter. Email us directly. You can find me at eric@chinaafricaproject.com. We're still getting Cobus's email sorted out. So if you want to talk to Cobus, just send it to me and I will pass it on to him as well. So we love getting emails from you about what you think, and we're going to have and speaking of which, future shows, we're going to have Luke Patey on coming up very soon to talk about his article in the Financial Times that he wrote about China's failing model in Africa. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. That's the end of our month-long wrap leading up to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit. Once again, just a quick reminder, we have these reporting guides, these 10 fact sheets that you can find both on my LinkedIn page, also on Twitter as well, and on our newsletter. So they're all over. If you want the fact sheets and you haven't received it, just email me again. My email is in the show notes here. I'd be happy to send them to you in either English or in Chinese. So we'll be back again very soon with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus @Stadinsky or Eric @eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.chinaafricaproject.com.